Good day. Today is Thursday, 28th August 2025. We continue to be in what appears to be a somewhat calm period in terms of international diplomacy. The Europeans continue to discuss with each other security guarantees and troop deployments to Ukraine. The Americans continue to play a very complex game of saying on the one hand that they support this idea and that they will provide it some assistance, but it's very unclear what that assistance actually will involve. And of course the Pentagon, Elbridge Colby, has apparently informed the Europeans that actual American help will be minimal. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians continue to talk about a ceasefire, even though Donald Trump has agreed with Vladimir Putin that the idea is unworkable. Steve Witkoff talks about a peace agreement being worked out by the United States and Russia by the end of the year. The same kind of optimistic claims that we've heard many times. Earlier this year, the Americans were giving the impression that a ceasefire had been practically agreed already between the Ukrainians and the Russians and the Americans. I remember that there was word out that it would be signed off in a week's time or at the beginning of April or by Easter or by some other time. And, well, that, of course, didn't happen. And the Americans have also spoken up in the past about imminent meetings between Putin and Zelensky. Donald Trump gave the impression just a few days ago, about a week ago, that the meeting between Putin and Zelensky would take place on the 22nd of August, that Putin had agreed to that Putin had agreed to security guarantees being provided by the Western powers and European military deployments in Ukraine also having been agreed by Putin. And as I have repeatedly and clearly pointed out, and as Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has now exhaustively pointed out, none of that has turned out to be true. For the record, I suspect that in making these statements, suggesting that we are closer to an agreement than we really are, the president and his officials are again playing for time. That for time in the sense that they are worried, they're still worried about Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Richard Blumenthal's bone-crushing sanctions bill. They don't want to impose 100% tariffs on China or 100% tariffs on Russia for that matter. They don't want to do any of those things. They understand perfectly well that if they got into the trap, or fell into the trap of doing any of those things, China would again withhold supplies of rare earths, as it did in the spring. China would also take retaliatory tariff measures. American shops, retail shops, would quickly start to run short of finished goods. They don't want to do any of those things, so they're giving, again, more optimistic signals about the real situation in the diplomacy than the facts actually warrant. To repeat again, I don't think that the talks in Anchorage resulted in any concrete agreement whatsoever between Putin and Trump, other than the single one that the process should proceed by way of negotiations to a final settlement and that there should be no interim ceasefire. I think that just as the Trump administration is stringing the Europeans and the neocons in the United States by talk of security guarantees, imminent agreements with the Russians, summit meetings between Putin and Zelensky, and all of those things, basically to put off the day until, well, who knows what, so that they can avoid imposing the massive sanctions and tariffs that they are so reluctant and unwilling to impose. I think that in exactly the same way as they're stringing the Europeans and the neocons in the United States along, they've to some extent been stringing the Russians along by leading the Russians to think that the United States is serious about talking about the general security situation in Europe. Certainly, and I've read more reports about this in the Russian media, I get the distinct impression that this is what the Russians think. They believe that there was a discussion about this issue between Putin and Trump at the meeting in Anchorage. I suspect it's also been talked about to some extent between the Americans and the Russians through the back channel contacts. But I don't myself believe that there is any definite, genuine, sincere commitment by the Trump administration to discuss with the Russians, especially not with the Russians, any of these matters. So we are, in a sense, looking at a kind of shadow play. There's the appearance of diplomatic activity, but the appearance is entirely confined to Europe, where European leaders, Starmer, Macron, Merz, Meloni, Keir, Callas, all of them, are busy talking with each other about security guarantees and troop deployments to Ukraine, which are never going to happen, and which, by the way, both their militaries and the publics of their countries do not want. And the Russians are telling themselves that sooner or later they're going to have a discussion with the Americans about the general security situation in Europe, which, again, I don't myself believe there is ever going to happen, and of which I see no sign of any willingness to engage in from the United States. So, as I said, it's all maneuvering about ultimately nothing. It's all being conducted in a strange sort of vacuum. In the meantime, Zelensky continues to take no step at all in the actual negotiating format that in fact exists. There's still no word, according to the Russians, about Zelensky or the Ukrainians agreeing to move forward with the Russian proposal to set up the three working parties that would meet and discuss possible ways forward to assist the negotiation process supposedly taking place between the Ukrainians and the Russians in Istanbul. I get no sense that Zelensky is at all interested in this process and would like to see it dead. And for the rest, I don't really see any sign of genuine movement at all. That, it seems to me, is the reality of the diplomatic situation at the present time. There continue to be some favourable signals from the United States to the Russians. I discussed those in my last programme. And by the way, I've heard some more information from an email correspondent about these. This person, who has some inside knowledge, he tells me that to his knowledge, the business contacts, Exxon and Rosneft, that the initiative came from the Americans. The Americans wanted to resume the collaboration. They were hoping, Exxon was hoping, that it would be able to come back to Russia, resume the work in Sakhalin, resume the work in the Arctic, which apparently is seen by Exxon as an even more lucrative operation than the Sakhalin operation. It was the Exxon that asked for the various meetings, that asked for the meeting with Igor Sechin, the chief executive officer of Rosneft in Doha. And from what I understand, the Russians listened to what the Americans proposed, but they were not particularly keen. The Russians have already worked on collaborative ventures with Chinese and, by the way, also Indian companies. They've also worked very hard on developing their own drilling technology, underwater drilling technology for the Arctic as well. And in the 3.5 years since Exxon pulled out, actually much longer than that, because that project ended in 2014. Anyway, since that project was abandoned, the Russians have made considerable progress sorting out the technology here too. And Rosneft doesn't feel that it needs the Americans anymore. And they believe that they can do the development in the Arctic fields themselves, using their own technology and using more reliable partners drawn from the BRIC states than the Americans, Exxon, turned out to be. So I understand that the Russians, as they always do, listened carefully to what the Americans said, what the Americans proposed, but they realized very quickly that Exxon is in no position to make any commitments by itself. It needs a decision by the US government to start lifting sanctions. The Russians don't believe that the sanctions are going to be lifted under any circumstances, even if there was a possibility of a peace agreement with Ukraine. So the Russians listen to the Americans, but get on with their own business. That is what I understand actually happened. So there it is. And to repeat again, for the Russians, at the moment, focusing on winning the war continues to be the most important priority. Now, on that topic, let me now discuss the situation in the war, because we've had some rather interesting developments over the last 24 hours. Firstly, over the course of the last 24 hours, the Russians conducted another massive strike on Ukraine. Much of it focused again on Kiev, the city of Kiev. Hundreds, apparently something like 600 Geran drones were used. Some of these apparently now included the jet-powered Geran 3 drones. At least 2 Kinjal hypersonic missiles were also used. Some KH-101 and Calibre missiles were also used. And there were attacks on many locations across Ukraine. It is the ones in Kiev that have attracted the most attention. And if you go by the British media and the European media, the two targets that the Russians hit, which have attracted the most attention of all, was the empty British Council building and the empty office of the European Union in Kiev. And this has been the big story in London. I don't know why the Russians specifically attacked these buildings. There is a long report about the attack on the British Council building in the Daily Telegraph, which claims that Vladimir Putin and the Russian authorities hate and loathe the British Council. Now, I'm going to say that is something which, to my knowledge, is wrong. Can't speak for Putin himself. I don't know what he thinks of the British Council. But my wife and I have had some interaction, did have some interaction with the British Council office in Moscow. Of course, it has been closed since then. And at that time, far from sensing any hostility on the part of the Russian authorities towards the British Council, the overwhelming impression was that, on the contrary, relations between the staff of the British Council, who were mostly Russian, by the way, and the Russian authorities at that time was, if anything, rather good. The major concern that some people, the people working in the British Council had, the worries they had, were not about their interactions with the Russians. It was with their interactions with the people in London, just say. So I don't think the Russians have any particular animus against the British Council as an institution, but it is quite likely that they believe, rightly or wrongly, that some kind of activities would be conducted in the British Council offices in Kiev and perhaps at the European Union offices as well. I seem to remember that over the course of an earlier attack on at least some British office, I can't remember which, in Kiev, I received information that the Russians had learnt or had been provided with information. It was the British Passport Office, in fact, in Kiev, that the Russians had received information that the building in question was being used to prepare documents for Ukrainian special forces, which the Ukrainian special forces would use in operations deep undercover in Russia itself. I don't know whether that is true or not. It may have been completely untrue, but I suspect that the Russians did have that information and did believe it. The information itself might have been wrong. But anyway, I suspect that the Russians have received similar information about what is going on, or what has been going on, in the British Council building and in the building of the European Union. Again, it may be that the information the Russians have or think they have is wrong, but whatever, it was enough apparently to decide for the Russians that they should make it a target. The Russians have provided information about this strike. Most of the targets appear to have been factories, industrial buildings, parts of the Ukrainian energy complex, military installations across Ukraine. I noticed that the giant Artyom factory in Kiev was attacked again. It is a factory that is coming under repeated attacks by the Russians, and I must assume that by now large parts of this factory have been severely damaged and probably by now are no longer operable. Now, the Russians, it's perhaps worth saying, have not so far deployed their big, super powerful missile, the Oreshnik, in these latest missile strikes. The Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, has claimed that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, received an analysis, a study from the Russian Defense Ministry, and a proposal that the Oreshnik missile system be used against government buildings in Kiev as part of a decapitation strike. He apparently rejected the proposal outright. I suspect because he was worried more than anything else that use of a missile of that kind in the middle of a city like Kiev would cause very heavy civilian casualties. There's been no attempt to use the Oreshnik so far against the Artyom factory or any other factories in Kiev, or against the Patriot missile batteries that are located in the Zaluzhny airport nearby. But quite plausibly, at some point it will be. I think that Putin, by the way, is probably wise definitely wise not to use a missile as powerful as the Oreshnik against government buildings in the center of Kiev. I think that this would cause enormous devastation and quite plausibly lead to very, very heavy loss of life for uncertain benefits at a practical level for Russia. So anyway, that was one of the things that happened last night. The Ukrainians, by the way, for the record, again are claiming that they shot down nearly all of the Geran drones and most, or at least half of the missiles that were launched. There's film all over Ukraine showing explosions as the drones and the missiles have their impacts. I think, as is so often the case, the Ukrainians are massively overstating the success of their air defense. And frankly, they're doing so to an extent that destroys their credibility in relation to pretty much everything else they say about their success in fighting the Russians. Now, I say this, I continue to receive a steady stream of information about the intelligence leak that allegedly took place from the General Staff, the Ukrainian General Staff, about 10 days ago. I've been getting more and more information about that leak. I know something of some of the Western agencies that are also working through this leak as well. I don't want to say anything more because obviously this is a sensitive topic. But I'm coming increasingly round to the view that a lot of the information in this leak is true. I say nothing more than that. I haven't the ability myself to study and check out the documents, but the accumulation of evidence or information that I am starting to see points to this information, much of this information from this leak being accurate. And of course, that contrasts with what the Ukrainians themselves have been saying about their own losses. And it looks to me, I have to say this, as if we have the same pattern with these missile strikes as well. The Ukrainians downplaying the damage that is being done to themselves, massively overstating their own success rate, probably giving Western governments who rely on information being given by the Ukrainians to an excessive degree, a wildly over-optimistic sense of the true situation. And perhaps in a way that is working against Ukrainian interests, because it leads Western governments to think that the situation in the war is going better, far better for Ukraine and far worse for Russia than it really is, and that is causing complacency, and the result is that it is the Russians who are able to continue to make ground, both on the ground and in the sky. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. on this topic. I will round out by saying that the Ukrainians continue to make drone strikes, and now I think it's clear that their primary target is Russian refineries. And we've been privileged on the Duran to be in touch with Stanislav Koprivnik, who's of course in Russia and has contacts in the Russian oil and energy industry. And he basically confirms much of what I've been saying already, that it is not unusual for there to be gasoline shortages in Russia at this time of year. This is a time of very, very heavy gasoline use because people are moving around Russia in cars, large numbers of cars, because of their holidays. And that it's not unusual for the Russian authorities to impose export restrictions at around this time. And yes, the Ukrainian drone attacks are probably having some effect, but nowhere near as important an effect as the Ukrainians themselves appear to think, or as some sections of the media in the West are suggesting. To make a point I've not made before, but which bears repeating, the Russian military itself uses diesel oil, not gasoline, in its vehicles. So, by the way, does industry and agriculture in Russia. Passenger vehicles use petrol, gasoline, but of course the Russian military and the manufacturing and agricultural economies mostly don't. They mostly use diesel. I will return to the topic of the state of the Russian economy later in this program. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the big missile strike. Now let's discuss the situation on the front lines, because we've had more news about the overall situation, and it tends to bear out a little of what I've been saying in recent programs, specifically about the Pokrovsk, Constantinfka situation. I have been saying that the reason why we have been getting less information about the situation in Pokrovsk and Constantinfka recently is almost certainly because a major military operation is underway, and the Russian authorities, the Russian military authorities, have told the bloggers and reporters and the soldiers that they must not disclose any information prematurely about this operation whilst it is underway until they are permitted to do so by the Russian military. Now, again, to repeat a point I've made in the past, Russian military bloggers, Telegram channels, Rebar and all of them, they are extraordinarily self-critical or overcritical people. Many of them write in extremely gloomy terms about Russia's military performance in the war. Much of this information then gets picked up in Ukraine and in the West, and it is republished without perhaps understanding that this is basically a national trait to go out of one's way to appear as critical as possible. There's a very good discussion about this phenomenon just out on the blog, the Substack blog, Events in Ukraine, in which it discusses contrasting Russian and Ukrainian analyses, discussions, commentaries about the competence and performance of the Rubicon group, the new drone operating group, or company, if you will, that is operating in Russia. As the writer of this blog points out, the Ukrainians are in awe of the Rubicon group. They see it as an institution, an organization of extraordinary efficiency that is causing them enormous amounts of damage. And of course, there are some Russian commentators who could clearly think the same way. But, of course, inevitably, and this is entirely characteristic, you will find some Russian commentators who, on the contrary, see the Rubicon Group as failing in all sorts of serious ways. Its plans are not coherent. Its integration with the military, the rest of the military, is not successful. Things are not being done as well as they should be. The right and obvious thing to do in order to correct all the problems of the Rubicon Group is to follow the advice of whichever blogger, Russian blogger, is writing about its problems, to put him basically in charge, and all the problems will be sorted out. So these are not easy people to discipline or control, but the Russian military does seem to be able to get them to observe silence at any moment when an operation is underway, and they are told to observe that silence in order to get not to complicate the way in which the military operation is being performed. I get the sense sometimes that the Russian authorities, who know perfectly well about this doom-laden style that some of these bloggers adopt, it basically indulges them with this on the understanding that when they're given instructions, they will actually carry them out. Instructions in this case, not to publish information. Now, that brings me back to the situation in Pokrovsk, because I said in my previous video that we're starting to get dribbles of information, and it's a fragmentary picture, but it does look as if some kind of storming operation in Pokrovsk itself is underway. And I said this mostly in the context of a video that the Ukrainians themselves released of a tank, I presume it's a Leopard 2 tank, shelling a building in the micro-district in the southwest of Pokrovsk, the citadel area there. The Ukrainians shelling one of the buildings in this micro-district, confirming in effect that the Russians had captured the building in question, which confirmed that Russian soldiers in some capacity had infiltrated into the micro-district and were already in occupation of at least some buildings there. Well, what happened afterwards is that the Russians then released their own video footage, not of this particular incident, but what appears to be the same tank. And the tank withdrew from the territory of this micro-district and started to retreat into the center of Pokrovsk. And when it reached the center of Pokrovsk, the Russians, who had been tracking its movement, attacked it with multiple FPV drones, and the tank was hit and was apparently destroyed. Now, this information is coming alongside further information which shows very heavy shelling by the Russian military of Ukrainian positions in central Pokrovsk and also in north-central Pokrovsk, beyond the railway line. Now, a couple of days ago, about a week ago, the Ukrainians claimed that they'd carried out a counterattack inside Pokrovsk and that they'd pushed the Russians back and that they had regained secure control of central Pokrovsk. They never, so far as I know, ever provided any actual video footage to confirm that this was true. I think the latest information now, frankly, argues against this. It seems to me much more likely now, from what we can see, that the reality is that the Russians managed to repel whatever counterattack the Ukrainians were able to launch in central Pokrovsk. And it is the Russians, in fact, who are still in central Pokrovsk. There is obviously intense fighting going on there, and much of this fighting appears to be taking place along the main railway lines and in the area of the E50 road as it bisects Pokrovsk. And yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the village of Leondovichi, which is located to the southwest of Pokrovsk, in fact, it's not really a village at all. It's basically a spur of Pokrovsk, that has fallen under Russian control. And that also appears to show that the Russians now are in control of at least the southern areas of Pokrovsk, other perhaps than the citadel area, if you like, in the micro-district in the southwest. So it looks to me as if the Ukrainian counterattack, assuming that there ever even was one, was probably a failure. It's been suggested that this was a new tank, a relatively new tank in relatively good condition. And it's also been suggested that it belonged to a brigade that had been recently deployed by the Ukrainian army as part of the operation to stabilize the situation around Pokrovsk following the Russian breakthrough northeast of Pokrovsk. The presence of this tank and other elements of this brigade within Pokrovsk, in that case, confirms the information that I received some days ago from a source, an email correspondent, who has information from within Russia, that what the Russian military have in fact been doing is that they've created a kind of spider's web in Pokrovsk itself and in the territories to the north, east and west of Pokrovsk, a spider's web of special forces, aircraft units, drones operated by the Rubicon Group and others, and they are tasked with luring into this web Ukrainian reinforcements and destroying them there. And that the Russians actually, if they wished, had the ability to storm and complete the capture of Pokrovsk by now, but that they were delaying doing so because their priority continued to be and remains luring Ukrainian military formations to the Pokrovsk area, the better to destroy them there, in a way that is intended ultimately to continue the long process of draining Ukraine's reserves. So all of the information is starting to stack up. Now, there is further news in other areas around Pokrovsk. Not only does there appear to be intense fighting going on in central Pokrovsk and in southern Pokrovsk, indeed I've even heard it suggested that the Russians are close to capturing the entire southern half of Pokrovsk, south of the railway line. I don't believe that, by the way. I think that we are still some distance from that point. I think that Ukrainian resistance in the micro-district continues to be very strong. But anyway, not only are the Russians fighting in Pokrovsk, but they are fighting in other places too. They appear to be gradually expanding the territory that they control in Mirnograd. There is significant information now that they control at least, well, some say up to 60% of Rodinsk to the north of Pokrovsk. And it looks as if they are gradually, step by step, working to first encircle and then storm the city, the small town of Kharkov, to the northeast of Pokrovsk, to the east of this area where the Russian breakthrough has taken place. And to repeat again, Ukrainian attempts to reverse the breakthrough have failed. The Russians may have lost control of Zaloty Kolodyaz, though there are some Russian reports that claim that the Russians still have a presence on the immediate eastern outskirts of this village, but they seem to have retained control of all of the other villages that they captured in this area, including the important village of Kucherev Yar. So the Russians are still there. They still continue to broaden their breakthrough area, and it looks as if they still have troops west of the main supply road that passes through Rodinska, and that they're still able to operate to the south of Dobropilia, which they are also heavily bombing, and in other places. But there's also been news from the southwest of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians have finally acknowledged that the Russians are indeed in secure control of Kotlino, village to the southwest of Pokrovsk, which the Russians captured many months ago. The Ukrainians then spent much of the winter trying to recapture it. They claimed several times to have recaptured it. In my opinion, it has always remained under Russian control, and the Russians have managed to repel all the many Ukrainian counterattacks intended to recapture it. Anyway, the Ukrainians now essentially admit that Kotlino is indeed under Russian control. The Russians, as I've already said, have for some days now been claiming that they've also captured Udachny, and there are also scattered claims and rumors that Russian troops have advanced north of Kotlino and Udachny and are now in the process of surrounding the Pokrovsk mine, located to the west of Pokrovsk. I believe, by the way, this is the mine which produces much of the coking coal used by Ukraine's steel industry. Just saying. But anyway, that the Russians have supposedly begun the operation to capture the mine and perhaps capture the village of Sergeyevka, which is located to the west. The point is that if the Russians do capture Sergeyevka, and even more importantly the Pokrovsk mine, then the E50 road lies just to the north. It is in effect unusable. At that point, the Russians would be in a position to cut the road, the E50 road, perhaps also to attack Grishina, the village just to the north of the road. There's reports that Russian reconnaissance parties have approached Grishina in the past, operating from the west, sent from the area of Rodinska. Anyway, the point is, if this road is indeed closed, then, as I've discussed in earlier videos, Pokrovsk is in a double cauldron. The troops in southwest Pokrovsk probably to a great extent already are. The Russians seem to allow some men and machines, some brigades and units to enter Pokrovsk, and we saw one of their tanks operating in the micro district in the southwest. But of course, if the Russians are as deep inside Pokrovsk as they appear to be, and if they do eventually, and they do, or rather when they do, capture the Pokrovsk mine, they will have closed all the key supply roads. And at that point, as I said, the battle for Pokrovsk becomes an exercise in squeezing a cauldron. There would be no effective escape for the Ukrainian troops still holding out in southwest Pokrovsk. There would be no means for them to escape, and there would be no means for them to receive reinforcements or supplies either. So we're still getting, by and large, relatively fragmentary information. But taken together, it does seem to point to a deterioration in the situation in Pokrovsk. The situation for the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk is getting worse. The Russians continue to be in the center of the city. They have apparently complete air control. Their drones dominate the skies, and their grip on Pokrovsk and on the areas nearby continues to tighten. And we've had similar news from Constantinfka. Now, this is a more complicated story because we've had even less information coming from Constantinfka. But this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry said that a village called Filipovka, which is located to the southwest of Constantinfka, has also been captured. Now, this village is close to the village of Predechine. Its capture would appear to confirm Russian control of the entire area of the south of the Kliban-Bek reservoir. By the way, the Redovka has published its own account of this battle for the Kliban-Bek, for the area south of the Kliban-Bek reservoir. It says that the reason that the Ukrainians held out for so long there is because it's high ground. It also looks down upon Constantinfka, and that this entire area was seen by the Ukrainians as essentially a kind of fortress belt covering the southern part of Constantinfka. And of course, it was a risky thing to do because it meant that behind the fortress there was a reservoir, a body of water, and that lent the whole geography to creation of a trap, and that trap has indeed closed. It looks as if the Russians, as I said, now control the whole of the territory south of the Kliban-Bek reservoir. And I think it was according to Redovka, but there are claims now that those Ukrainian troops who did escape did so by swimming, basically swimming across the reservoir, which is relatively small. Attempt to cross the reservoir by boat proved impossible because of the presence of the Russian FPV drones. So anyway, a crisis in Constantinfka, Filipovka now captured. As one can see that the noose on Constantinfka is tightening, just as the noose on Pokrovsk is. It's a different situation. One town is gradually being surrounded and stormed. The other town, Pokrovsk, it's more, as I said, the spider web, drawing in Ukrainian units, sucking them in so that they can be taken apart one by one. Now, the fighting in Pokrovsk, Constantinfka is not the only place where fighting continues to take place. And I've discussed this in many programs now, though I do believe that this is the Schwerpunkt, the point of decision, the center of gravity of the Russian offensive. The Russians need to capture Pokrovsk and Constantinfka to break the defense line in Donbass, the Ukrainian defense line in Donbass. Once Pokrovsk and Constantinfka have fallen, the two remaining cities under Ukrainian control in Donbass, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk become exceptionally vulnerable and will almost certainly and probably fairly rapidly will fall. But there is fighting going on in other places too. There's been more reports about the Russians expanding the area that they control south of the Serebyanka and Kremenaya forests and the village of Kolodizy, gradually cutting off Seversk from resupply, and also taking more territory and villages around Liman. So there is that battle, and it is an important battle. There's also been a lot of information about the situation near the city of Zaporozhye. The Russians apparently have advanced further north along the Dnieper River. They've captured Plavny, they've captured Kamenskaya, a village immediately to the south of Zaporozhye, located on the east bank of the Dnieper River. The Russians have captured it. They've captured Plavny, which is located to the north of Kamenska. They have captured certain important sections of the village of Stepnogorsk, which is located slightly further north, and they appear to be advancing northward along the east bank of the river. And apparently there's now Ukrainian film showing Ukrainian FPV drones attacking Russian positions in a village called, I believe, Primorske, which is located, well, actually, very close, much closer to the city of Zaporozhye altogether. The Russians are inching northwards along the river towards Zaporozhye. And I discussed in a recent program how Russian drones are starting to operate, apparently, over the city of Zaporozhye itself. And I don't believe that the Russians intend to storm Zaporozhye from the south. I think the area of the breakthrough is too small. I think that their main purpose in this advance is to cut the southern supply roads from Zaporozhye, leading to the two towns of Orekhov and Gulyapolye. The Russians are advancing from the east also towards these two towns. I think they calculate that if the supply roads from Zaporozhye to these two towns are cut, and this would be done using FPV drones, then Orekhov and Gulyapolye will fall, and fall relatively quickly, and that will indeed bring the Russians much closer to Zaporozhye and to a position where they can begin the battle for that major city of Ukraine. And I should say that if we do get to a situation, perhaps towards the end of the year, when the Russians are outside the city of Zaporozhye, and it looks as if Zaporozhye, which is located mostly on the east bank of the Dnieper, is being invested by the Russian army, that the Russians are in the process of encircling it and are beginning an operation to capture it, well, then that will be a crisis for Ukraine. Zaporozhye and the city of Dnipro to the north, taken together, arguably form Ukraine's industrial heartland. I've discussed the importance of the Dnieper itself as Ukraine's major artery. If Zaporozhye were to be besieged by the Russians, and of course if it were to be captured by the Russians, then Ukraine would face an existential crisis, and it would no longer be viable as a state. So we're some months away, at the very least, from that situation. But the Russians are indeed creeping northwards gradually towards Zaporozhye, and it must be a worrying situation for the Ukrainians. Further west, there is the intrigue about what the Russians are planning to do in Herson city. The Russians have now themselves produced video footage of their long-range drones attacking Ukrainian vehicles along one of the main roads that leads to the town of Herson, the city of Herson, on the west bank of the Dnieper River in Herson region. And it does look as if the Russians are in the process of closing at least this road and perhaps a road that lies immediately to the north that also leads to Herson city, to trying to close these roads, thereby complicating Ukrainian resupply. Now, I did express some skepticism a couple of days ago about a potential Russian amphibious operation across the Dnieper to recapture Herson city. I said that late summer, early autumn doesn't appear to me to be the best time to do this. Probably the situation along the river is quite placid and the sea is quite placid in late August and September and perhaps even some of October. But beyond that, we get the rainy season, the Rasputitsa, keeping troops resupplied across the river, significant forces resupplied across the river, would be a significant challenge, unless the Russians, of course, have some plans to build bridges across the river, pontoon bridges across the river, which they certainly have the expertise to do, but they would also need to provide secure defense for those bridges from Ukrainian drones and indeed from Ukrainian aircraft and HIMARS rockets and all that kind of thing. So I'm not sure about the logic of doing this now, because the window is small. The window is relatively small, and I can very easily see how in the days after an amphibious landing, any Russian force that crosses the Dnieper might find itself in some logistical difficulty. But then, of course, we are now in the 3.5 years into this conflict. By now, the Russians will have perfected many things. They have obviously learned many lessons. They are particular experts in this kind of thing. Probably, presumably, if they are planning to do it at all, they've worked it all out, and we will see. The last thing I want to say is that a few weeks ago, we were reading an awful lot about the Ukrainian counterattacks in Sumy region. Then General Syrskyi, the Ukrainian commander, admitted that the counterattacks had been unsuccessful, and the Ukrainians have called off their counterattacks in Sumy region. What they are in fact now obliged increasingly to do is to withdraw military units from both Sumy and Kharkov region, from the Volchansk and Sumy areas, in order to try to hold positions in Donbass. And who knows, perhaps before long in Zaporozhye and Herson regions as well. And that is starting to leave Sumy region relatively short of men and machines. It is entirely possible that over the next couple of days, Group of Forces North, which has just received a visit by the Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov, might resume its offensive And of course, if it does, and it starts to work towards the city of Sumy, well, the alarm bells in Kiev will start to ring extremely loud. And it'd be very interesting to see how Zelensky and his officials react, and whether they will make the strategic choice, which they might be obliged to do, which is to abandon territory elsewhere on the front lines, to abandon places like Liman and Seversk, or conceivably even more important positions in Zaporozhye region, in order to find reinforcements to try to hold back the Russian advance in the north towards Kiev itself via Sumy, and conceivably towards the city of Kharkov. So anyway, that's my take over the overall military situation. Now, I discussed the Rubin Kont group earlier in the program, and here it might be worth saying that just a few weeks ago, as I sort of remember, the narrative that was being spun in the West is that despite the severe shortages of infantry, the Ukrainians were able to hold their lines because they developed this huge drone wall, and that the drones were proving incredibly successful in holding back the Russians, and the Russian advance was being checkmated by this great Ukrainian drone wall. I always said that I thought this argument was ridiculous, and I also pointed out in several programs that in fact it is the Russians, not the Ukrainians, who have achieved the greatest progress in drone warfare. It is the Russians who have now swamped the skies with drones, driven the Ukrainian drones out of the skies, not entirely. You still find them in some places, but in many areas, Russian anti-drone units have and electronic jamming units have successfully defeated the Ukrainian drones. And anyway, I mean, it is the Russians, in other words, who are winning the war in the sky, who are winning the drone war. Now, it's very interesting to see how this narrative about the Ukrainian drone wall, which we were hearing so much about, how that has now quietly died. You never read any articles making that claim any longer in the Western media. This is because, of course, the Ukrainian media is full of stories, on the contrary, about the lopsided advantages that the Russians have in drones. And of course, the Russians have lopsided advantages in other things, in artillery, in armored vehicles, though at this present point in the war, when the fighting is taking shape around urban areas, the Russians have learnt to use armored vehicles less and are relying on infantry more. Once they've broken through Donbass, armored offensives will become viable again. But anyway, it's interesting to see how this whole narrative about Ukraine's great successful drone wall has now quietly died. I suppose there's always a chance that it will be revived again, but I don't get much sign of it myself, and I don't believe that it ever will be revived, because I don't believe that the drone wall ever really existed or was ever a truly successful defense tactic. And I read somewhere a Ukrainian commander actually say this, that drones can fulfill a role in the war, but they have to be combined with infantry and artillery remains the main instrument. And of course, in terms of artillery, it is the Russians who continue to have the decisive advantage. Last year, as the Russians captured Avdiivka and began their big advance westwards, the advance that caused them to capture the towns of Selidovo, Kurakovo, Novogrodivka, and Ugledar, and Krasnogorovka as well. I pointed out that Western commentators were in denial about the critical situation and about the poor state of the Ukrainian military, the increasingly perilous state of the Ukrainian military. They are in even further denial now. Now that the Russians have finally arrived at the last fortified line, the new narrative is to spin the fact that Russian advances are not measured in tens of kilometers, but sometimes in hundreds of meters. But of course, if you are up against a fortified line, a line of cities, and you need to break through that line of cities, then of course, inevitably, the speed of your advance will slow. Though this is a very relative fact in this battle, because in some places, in southwest Donbass, for example, and in some of the areas around these cities, the Russian advances are indeed quite rapid. But anyway, this, to repeat again, is another narrative. It does not actually address the critical realities that are playing out on the battlefields. In fact, it's extraordinary how when one narrative dies, the drone war dies, another narrative takes its place. And to repeat a comment I saw in the Daily Telegraph, the impregnable fortress line of cities in Donbass, a fortress line that I've been talking about for years, but which the media in the West up to now has ignored, that has now taken the place of the drone wall. This has a little more reality behind it than the drone wall did, but of course it is the Russians who are going to break through. And one wonders when they do break through and when they do capture these cities, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Constantinfka, Pokrovsk, one wonders what, if any, narrative will finally take its place. Now, this then brings me back to the topic of diplomacy. The Russians, as far as I can tell, are sticking to their essential terms, which are Istanbul Plus, the conditions, the territorial and other conditions that Putin set out in his speech to the Foreign Ministry made on the 14th of June 2024. I don't believe that the Russians have retreated from any part of this up to now. They perhaps indicated some flexibility on a potential ceasefire if the Ukrainians were to withdraw from Donbass, which is after all where the whole conflict began. The Russians might, for a time, be prepared to accept a ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Herson. I don't believe that they are accepting yet a freeze of the conflict lines there, by the way. But the fact remains that whatever the Americans might have proposed to the Russians and whatever the Russians might have said about that to the Americans, so far the Ukrainians have made no concessions of any kind at all. They are not prepared to drop their NATO membership bid. They're not prepared to restore rights to use the Russian language, the Orthodox Church. They're not prepared to give pledges about nuclear weapons, about the size of their armed forces, about NATO membership, or any of these things. The Americans, the US administration, gave guidance to the media before Zelensky's trip to Washington with the European leaders about 2 weeks ago now, that the Americans were expecting Zelensky to come with constructive counter proposals, but the fact is that he has come up with none. So, what happens if this stance remains as it is, that there is no ceasefire, end of the conflict, or anything of that kind, and the Russians capture the whole of Donbass and perhaps reach the outskirts of the city of Zaporozhye and perhaps cross the Dnieper and occupy part or even all of Herson city? What happens then? I remember back in the summer of 2022, there was speculation, there were rumors that the Russians had told the Saudis that if the Russians did capture Donbass, they would make one final offer to the Western powers and to the Ukrainians, which is to accept the loss of Donbass, to accept a land bridge from Russia to Crimea, to accept that Ukraine would not join NATO, and to accept the other provisions of Istanbul Plus, failing which the war would continue and the Russians would continue that war until there was regime change in Kiev. Well, I don't know whether those 2022 rumours had any basis in them. In fact, it seems more likely that at that time, the Russians, who must have been aware of the enormous scale of the Ukrainian build-up and the fact that the Ukrainians were being equipped by the Russians, by the Americans, probably were more concerned at that time to find ways to stabilize the situation on their front lines ahead of the Ukrainian offensives in Kharkov region and in Herson region in 2022. But I do actually wonder whether possibly we might see something like that again, whether there might be another speech by Putin after Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Constantinfka finally fall, telling the Ukrainians, like, this is your last chance. You've lost Donbass, you're about to lose Zaporozhye and Herson as well. Either you agree to pull out and accept the rest of our terms as set out in Istanbul Plus, or it is a war that will continue until the government in Kiev has ended. Who knows? Anyway, we shall see. I suspect that something will have to happen when the Russians get to the western boundaries of Donbass. I can't imagine that the Russians will say nothing. And perhaps it's worth adding at this point that the Russians at that point might decide that the moment has come to modify their terms and to go beyond Istanbul Plus and start to impose further conditions. Now that then begs the question of what the administration and the Europeans are going to do. The Europeans currently are now talking about secondary sanctions. It seems that they've gradually accepted, this is according to Bloomberg, that sanctions against Russia are now exhausted. There's nothing more the Europeans can do against the Russians themselves. Perhaps ideas of imposing a blockade in the Baltic Sea have been dropped, at least for the moment. So the talk now is of secondary sanctions against Russia's trading partners. And there's logic in this, because I said discuss the situation with the Russian economy. Well, there was a big meeting in the Kremlin discussing the state of the Russian economy, and the Russian statistical agency Rosstat has provided information. I thought that there might have been an economic contraction in Russia in June and July because of the sky-high interest rates it turns out that there was not. There was low growth, 0.7% growth year on year in June, 0.4% growth year on year in July. But Russia avoided a contraction in those 2 months. The Russian finance minister, Anton Siluanov, is saying that he expects GDP growth in Russia this year to be at least 1.5%. And I've seen other estimates that suggest it's more likely to be around 2%, which, given how high the interest rates went, it would be a good outcome. And there are reports that the central bank is considering deep cuts in interest rates in September because inflation has been falling very fast. It's likely to hit 6% on an annualized basis by the end of the year. And for that reason, the period of high interest rates has achieved its effect. It's successfully cooled the economy, and there is the inflation crisis as such is ended. And of course, the logic here, the situation here, points to higher growth, a return to growth next year. Though Siluanov said that the Russians are aiming for a balanced budget next year, in which case there won't be the budgetary stimulus that we've seen previously. He says that will cause interest rates to fall even further without this having inflationary consequences as it did in 2024, which is probably true. So the Russians have got through this inflation spike. They seem to be coming to the end of it, and their economy continues to grow. So you can understand why Europeans who were telling each other at the start of this year that, because of the inflation, the Russians were in a really difficult position. The inflation, the interest rates pointed to the success of the sanctions, that they now understand finally that the sanctions are not going to work. But instead of accepting the logic of this, they are now talking about sanctions on Russia's trading partners instead, or supposedly to force the Russians to the negotiating table. In other words, to oblige the Russians to accept the ceasefire, NATO membership, payment of money to Ukraine, war crimes trials for Russian officials, all of the demands that Zelensky basically continues to make. Well, what that involves, secondary sanctions, this needs to be understood, is that the Europeans, having failed in their economic war against the Russians, having caused massive damage to their own economies as a result of trying to wage it, what the Europeans are now proposing to do is to extend that economic war to the rest of the world. To me, that looks like folly. I would go further. I would say it looks like madness. I mean, to actually think that this can possibly succeed is beyond comprehension. It will infuriate many countries around the world who will ask why they're being singled out for retaliatory measures of this kind, given that they are not involved in the war in Ukraine. They will probably be extremely angry about this, angry with the European Union. And it's difficult to see that there can be a better advertisement for the BRICS than this. Anyway, I'm going to discuss this more fully in my next program, because it does look as if this march of folly in Europe continues, and it looks like before long they're going to try to drag the Americans behind them. But this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.